I worked as a Navy SEAL for some years. We'll just call me John. I'm not going to spend time on my background, my training, or the path that got me here. None of that matters for what follows. The only thing that matters is that I was part of a job that took me to a lot of places most people never see. And that job put me in situations where paying attention to small details was not optional. Most deployments are exactly what you'd expect. Long stretches of preparation, movement, and waiting. You learn routes, check gear, move from one position to another, and try not to create problems for yourself. The work rewards people who stay calm. You notice what's in front of you, you deal with it, and you move on. A lot of time is spent in environments that are unfamiliar. Jungles, deserts, mountains, open water. Each one comes with its own set of practical issues. Heat, cold, visibility, footing, sound. You learn how those things affect you and your equipment, and after a while you stop thinking about them consciously. What doesn't get talked about much is how different places behave differently, even when nothing is technically wrong. Sound doesn't always travel the way it should. Distance doesn't always feel consistent. Sometimes things appear closer or farther than they are. Sometimes movement catches your attention for no clear reason. Most of the time those moments pass without incident and you forget about them later. Occasionally, they don't. I'm not talking about danger in the normal sense, not enemy contact, not accidents, not close calls that make good stories later. I'm talking about moments where something doesn't line up and there's no immediate explanation for why. When you work in a team, you learn quickly not to chase every odd sensation. If you reacted to everything that felt slightly off, you'd never get anything done. You log what you can, stay focused on the task, and keep moving. Most of the time, that's the right decision. Over the years, I was present for a handful of situations where that approach didn't fully resolve things. Events that didn't escalate, didn't turn violent, and mostly didn't get anyone hurt, but also didn't fit any category we normally use to describe what happens on an operation. What made those moments different was how consistent they felt afterward. Different locations, conditions, people. The same sense that something had occurred just outside the scope of what we were trained to notice. None of this interfered with the work. We completed missions, moved on, didn't dwell on it. That's how the job functions. You don't stop to assign meaning to things unless they demand action. Most of them didn't. I'm not presenting this as a single story or a connected chain of events. The things I'm describing didn't relate to each other in any obvious way, and I don't think they're part of some larger pattern. They're just a small number of moments that stayed clear in my memory long after everything else blurred together. I've had time since to think about what stood out and what didn't. Not in the sense of trying to solve anything, but in the sense of noticing which details never faded. The ones that stayed sharp were never the loud ones or dramatic ones. They were the quiet moments where something was present, acknowledged, and then left alone. What follows are a few of those moments, written the way I remember them. Nothing more. The Philippines deployment took place along the southern coast, in an area where jungle pressed right up against the water, and the ground never fully dried out. Even at night, the air stayed thick. Sweat soaked through gear faster than you expected, and every step had to be placed carefully to avoid roots, shallow pools, and soft ground that would give under your weight. We were moving inland from the shoreline, single file, with enough spacing to maintain visibility without stacking up. The water stayed to our left, dark and slow-moving, broken occasionally by mangroves that reached out like fingers. To the right, the jungle closed in almost immediately. Visibility dropped to a few yards in places, with vegetation layered so tightly that anything moving inside it would be half hidden unless it crossed a clear gap. The operation itself was straightforward. Confirm what we needed to confirm, then pull back out the same way we came in. No expected contact, no time pressure. The kind of movement where discipline matters more than speed. About 20 minutes in, something to the right caught my attention. Wasn't a sound. It was movement that didn't match everything else. Leaves shifted without the usual delay. Branches flexed without snapping. Whatever it was stayed just inside the tree line, moving parallel to us, never stepping fully into view. Well, at first, I assumed it was an animal reacting to our presence. The area had plenty of wildlife. Usually, though, animals bolted once they realized people were nearby. This didn't bolt. We took another dozen steps, and the movement stayed with us. Same distance and angle. When we slowed, it slowed. When we adjusted slightly to avoid a wet patch near the water, it adjusted too. I didn't call it out yet. There was no sudden threat, no reason to stop the whole line over something that might resolve itself. And then it crossed an opening between two trees. Just a flash at first. A shape passing through a narrow gap where moonlight filtered down. I caught enough to register that it wasn't low to the ground. Moved upright. Fast. It didn't bound or scramble. It ran. I raised my fist and the line halted. Everyone froze. Nobody spoke. The jungle continued its background noise like nothing had changed. I scanned the tree line carefully, watching for another break in movement. For several seconds, nothing happened. I gave the signal to move again, and as soon as we stepped off, it moved too. This time it stayed closer, crossing thinner vegetation where there were fewer layers to hide behind. I got a clearer look. It was on two legs, there was no mistaking that. The stride was long and even, the upper body angled forward as it ran. It was lean, narrow, and taller than it should have been for something moving that fast through tangled growth. The radio clicked in my ear. You seeing that? The point man asked. Yeah, I said. That was all that needed to be said. The thing stayed with us for another minute or two, pacing us exactly. Never rushed or hesitated. Never broke cover completely. It stayed just visible enough that I knew it was there, then slipped back behind leaves and branches before I could focus on details. The color registered clearly now. Green. Not bright or reflective. The kind of green that blends into vegetation until it moves. I never saw a face. Never saw eyes. Just a smooth outline passing through gaps faster than my brain wanted to process. At one point it crossed a wider break, maybe 15 feet across, and I got the clearest look I was gonna get. Two legs, upright posture, long stride, no gear, no weapon, no human movement pattern. I keyed my mic again. Don't follow it. The acknowledgement came back as a click. Nobody argued or suggested otherwise. A few seconds later, the movement changed direction. It simply peeled off deeper into the jungle and disappeared, as if it had reached the edge of whatever line it had been following. And we continued the operation. No further movement, no additional contact. We completed what we were there to do and moved back toward the water the same way we'd come in. Nobody brought it up after. There was nothing to add. Nothing had escalated. No action had been required. But later that night, back at the staging area, gear laid out and checked, the point man sat across from me, scraping dried mud off his boots with a piece of metal. He didn't look up when he spoke. That thing back there wasn't human. No, it wasn't, I replied. He nodded once and went back to what he was doing. And that was the end of that. We rotated out of that area a few days later. No similar reports or warnings passed down. No indication that anyone else had encountered the same thing. At the time, I treated it the way I treated anything that didn't interfere with the mission. I noted it and moved on. What stuck with me, it wasn't how fast it moved or how close it stayed. It was something else. You know, animals react. People react. This didn't react. It paced us, maintained distance, then disengaged without any visible reason. Years later, after other deployments and other environments, that memory has stayed sharper than most. There was no confusion in its movement, no hesitation, no adjustment once it started pacing us. It behaved like something that already understood what we were and where we were going. At the time, I didn't try to describe it beyond what I saw. I didn't label it. That wasn't useful. Much later, with enough distance from the moment to be honest about it, there was one comparison that fit better than the others. Not perfectly, but close enough. I realize this is going to sound crazy, but it looked like a giant lizard. The Afghanistan deployment came later, during a stretch where most of our operations took place in higher elevation terrain. The mountains there don't feel dramatic when you're first inserted. They feel dry, empty, and repetitive. Long ridgelines, narrow passes, rock everywhere. You learn quickly that sound behaves differently at altitude, especially in places where stone walls and cuts funnel it in directions you don't expect. The operation started as a movement through a mountain pass we'd used before. Not often, but enough that it wasn't unfamiliar. The route wasn't marked on any civilian map, but it was known, and it was considered safe enough for transit. But there were steep slopes on both sides, loose rock underfoot, and wind that cut through gear even during daylight. We were moving mid-morning. Visibility was good. No weather issues, no indication of contact in the area. The kind of movement where your attention stays on footing and spacing more than anything else. About halfway through the pass, I noticed the steps. First, I thought they were natural. Rock formations in that region can stack in ways that look deliberate from certain angles. But as we moved closer, it became clear that this wasn't erosion or chance. The stones formed a descending path, cut into the mountain, narrow but consistent in width and height. They went down. Not steeply at first, just enough to pull your eye away from the pass and toward the darker space below. I slowed and raised my hand. The line stopped. I crouched and examined the nearest step. The edge was worn smooth. I didn't say anything yet, but everybody could see it. The steps descended into shadow, curving slightly as they followed the shape of the mountain. The air coming up from below felt cooler, still. Even the wind seemed to stop at the top of the stair. Well, we debated briefly over comms whether to bypass it entirely. There was no operational reason to go down there. But there was also nothing that marked the area as restricted or dangerous. No signage or mention in any briefing. And in that environment, old structures weren't unheard of. Afghanistan is layered with things that predate modern borders by centuries. We descended. The steps narrowed slightly as they went down, forcing us to adjust spacing. Light dropped off quickly. The walls on either side rose higher, the rock face closing in. And the stairway opened into a cavern. Not a cave in the natural sense. The space was too regular. The walls curved deliberately, forming a wide cavern that extended beyond the reach of our lights. The ceiling rose high enough that the beam didn't find it right away. There were markings on the stone, not writing. Carvings, shallow and worn, and repeating in patterns that didn't seem decorative. They ran along the walls at consistent heights, like markers rather than art. We moved slowly, scanning, light sweeping. There was no movement or sound beside our own. And then the statue came into view. It dominated the center of the cavern, carved directly from the stone floor. A spider, detailed enough that individual segments were visible where light struck the surface. It was enormous. The body alone rose higher than our heads. The legs spread outward, anchoring it to the cavern floor in a way that made it feel less like a statue and more like something frozen in place. The surface was smooth in some areas, rough in others, as if different parts had been exposed to different conditions over time. The scale was what hit me first. The craftsmanship came second. Whatever had made this had known exactly what they were doing. The proportions were deliberate. The posture was deliberate. This wasn't a rough carving or an old marker. The cavern felt very old. We started to approach the statue when someone grabbed me hard by the shoulder. I spun, bringing my rifle up instinctively, and came face to face with a senior SO I recognized immediately. He wasn't part of our movement. He didn't raise his voice, but he grabbed my gear and pulled me backward toward the stairs. "Off limits," he said. The rest of the team froze, watching. "You all didn't see anything." That's all he said. There was no explanation or elaboration, just the statement. We moved. Nobody argued or asked questions. Whatever authority he carried was enough that the decision didn't feel optional. We ascended quickly, the air warming as we climbed. The sound of wind returned. Radio sounded normal again. When we reached the top, the pass looked exactly as it had before. The senior SO stayed below, out of sight. We rerouted without discussion. The operation continued along an alternate path that added hours to our movement. Nobody mentioned the cavern over comms. Nobody tried to revisit it. Later, back in our staging area, I looked for the senior SO and he wasn't there. Nobody seemed surprised by his absence. I asked one quiet question to someone who'd been around longer than I had. He shook his head once. "Don't," he said. And there was no report filed or note made. No mention of the steps, the cavern, or the statue in any documentation I saw. The area wasn't flagged officially, but it never appeared in our routing again. Over time, I learned that some places don't get marked on maps. They get handled differently, avoided without explanation, redirected around without comment. At the time, I didn't try to assign meaning to what we'd seen. Whatever that place was, we weren't meant to be there. The Iraq incident. Now, this happened after the fighting was over. That's important, because it rules out most of the explanations people reach for later. There was no incoming fire, no confusion about where we were, no adrenaline pushing things out of focus. The engagement had ended cleanly, and the area was secure. We were doing what comes next. Clearing, checking, moving methodically through what was left. The air smelled burnt. Not smoke exactly, but sharp mix of dust, metal, and something chemical that settles in your clothes and doesn't leave. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across broken concrete and collapsed walls. The heat was draining fast, replaced by that dry evening chill that creeps in once the light starts to go. We were moving through the remains of a small cluster of structures, not much left standing. Walls blown open, roofs collapsed inward, rubble everywhere. You had to watch your footing or you'd roll an ankle on loose stone or step onto something that shifted under your weight. A light mist started rolling in from lower ground. It stayed low, hugging the ground, moving slowly between debris and pooling in shallow depressions. We spread out, maintaining visual contact. And that's when I noticed the ground moving. It wasn't shaking or collapsing. It was moving. Subtle at first. A slow displacement beneath the mist, like something pushing from underneath instead of across the surface. The motion traced a shallow curve through the debris, about 30 yards ahead of us. We halted immediately. The movement didn't stop. It slid forward, smooth and continuous, passing behind a broken wall and reappearing on the other side. The mist parted around it, flowing over something solid instead of drifting freely. I stared at it, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with anything familiar. Dust settling doesn't behave like that. Neither does smoke. The shape emerged more fully when it crossed an open gap between piles of rubble, and it was long, thick, continuous. A single body moving as one piece. No visible limbs, no side-to-side motion. It advanced by pressure alone, sliding forward like something forcing its way through the ground without resistance. The radio clicked. "Are you seeing this?" one of the guys asked. The shape continued moving, angling slightly downhill. It never turned towards us or reacted to our presence. It behaved like we weren't there at all. And then it passed close enough that I could see detail. The surface was rough, not smooth. Earth and debris clung to it as it moved, and then fell away behind it. The mist swirled and closed in its wake. Whatever it was displacing ground as it went, not just sliding across the surface. "Is that a snake?" the guy beside me asked. I watched it move, watched how the ground responded around it. "I think it's a worm," I said. That was the closest comparison I had. The thing slowed as it reached a shallow depression near the edge of the structures. One of the bodies from the engagement lay there, partially obscured by debris. And the movement changed. The front end of the shape, if it even had a front, rose slightly, then pressed downward near the body. The ground shifted, and debris slid inward. And I still don't know if I imagined what came next. I swear I saw that body move. At least I think it did. I saw it move downward. There was no sound, no tearing or collapse, just displacement and then absence. The mist settled. The worm-like shape continued forward for another few yards, then sank lower, its outline fading as the ground closed above it. And within seconds, it was gone completely. No hole remained, no disturbed soil beyond what was already there from the engagement. If I hadn't been watching the exact spot, I wouldn't have known anything had changed. No one spoke. My brain kept replaying the moment, checking angles, lighting, distance, looking for something that could explain away what I thought I'd seen. I gave the signal to move. We advanced cautiously, stepping through the area where the thing had passed. The ground felt solid underfoot. No soft spots or signs of tunneling. No drag marks. Nothing that suggested something massive had just moved through it. But the body was gone. We finished clearing the area without incident. No further movement. No additional mist beyond what drifted naturally with the cooling air. That night, while we were staged and waiting, the same guy who'd spoken earlier sat down across from me. He rested his helmet on his knee and looked at the ground between us. "That thing," he said. I wasn't imagining it. "I think it took that body." I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said finally. And he nodded slowly. He didn't push it, and neither did I. That was the last time we talked about him. I have replayed that moment more times than I care to admit. You know, fatigue can do strange things. Smoke and mist can distort depth. Your mind can connect movements that aren't really connected. But two of us saw the same thing. We both saw the shape, we both saw where it went, and the body was gone afterward. Heavy things leave traces, though. Even when they disappear underground, something remains. There was nothing. Whatever that thing was, it passed through, took the body, and then left. The Somalia incident happened at night, during weather bad enough that most units would have postponed movement if they had the option. We didn't. The storm came in fast off the coast, pushing inland with heavy rain and wind that flattened scrub and turned dry ground into slick mud in minutes. Visibility dropped to almost nothing between lightning flashes. When the thunder rolled through, it didn't echo so much as smear across the sky, long and low, like the sound couldn't decide where to go. We were moving through terrain, low trees, scrub, open stretches broken by shallow washes and clusters of rock. Not the kind of place where you lose people easily, even at night. The spacing was tighter than usual because of the weather, but we maintained visual contact. Headlamps stayed off, and we relied on flashes of lightning. That was when one of our guys went missing. There was no shout or call over comms, no sudden break in formation that would have drawn attention. One moment he was there, moving just ahead and to my left, and the next he wasn't. We stopped immediately. I counted heads twice before saying anything. Same result both times. We called his name quietly over comms. No response. Tried again, louder. Still nothing. Rain hammered down hard enough that it masked anything smaller than thunder. Wind tore through the scrub in uneven burst, flattening at one moment and letting it spring back the next. We backtracked along our exact path. Same spacing and order. No sign of a struggle. No dropped gear. No disturbed ground beyond what the storm was already doing on its own. The missing guy was not careless. He was not inexperienced. He wasn't the type to wander or break formation. He was big too. 6'4", 240. Built like somebody who didn't get moved unless he decided to move. Well, we widened the search in controlled arcs, keeping line of sight when we could. And that was when someone spotted the backpack. It hung from a tree well off our path, silhouetted against the sky during a lightning strike. For a split second, it didn't register as anything more than debris caught in branches. Then another flash hit, and the shape resolved clearly. It was his pack, hanging at least 50 feet up. We moved toward it as carefully as the terrain allowed. The rain made everything slick, branches whipped in the wind. When we reached the base of the tree, I tilted my head back and followed the line of the trunk upward. The pack was suspended from a thick branch near the top, swaying slightly in the wind. No rope or cord, no fabric snagged or torn. It was just hanging there. I stared at it for a moment, trying to find a practical explanation. Something that fit the environment. Something that fit the man. He didn't climb trees. At least I'd never seen him do it. And there was no way he could have climbed that high in the dark, that quickly, in a storm with full kit. There were no scrape marks on the trunk, no broken branches below, nothing on the ground. The storm surged again, wind roaring through the scrub, rain hammering down sideways. For a few seconds, the noise overwhelmed everything. Then it stopped. Not the storm, just the wind. It dropped off suddenly, leaving rain falling straight down instead of sideways. And that's when we heard it. Not a sound from the ground. Above us. A rush of air, heavy, fast, like something large passing overhead at speed. There was no shape to it, no silhouette against the clouds. Just the unmistakable sense of mass moving through space right above the tree line. It lasted maybe a second, then it was gone. The wind surged again immediately afterward, branches whipping and rain slashing sideways like nothing had happened. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, someone broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" We stood there longer than we should have, rain soaking through gear, lightning flashing intermittently overhead. The pack continued to sway gently in the wind, untouched, and we resumed the search. We covered every direction, expanded the radius, checked the washes and low ground, looked for any sign of movement, any place someone could have fallen or been pulled. But the storm worked against us, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. But even accounting for that, there was nothing. No blood or torn fabric, no displaced ground that didn't already look like storm runoff. Eventually, Command called it, not because we were satisfied we weren't, but because there was nothing left to search. The weather wasn't improving. The risk to the rest of the team was rising. We recovered the backpack, lowered it carefully, and it was intact, nothing missing or added. His gear was inside, arranged the way he always kept it. We never found him. The area was searched again later, in daylight, after the storm passed. Different teams, better visibility. Same result. No body, no trace. There was no official explanation offered beyond the usual language used when something doesn't fit. Separated, lost, overwhelmed by terrain. None of it accounted for the pack. None of it accounted for the type of man he was. And none of it accounted for what we heard overhead. The loss stayed with us. Men don't just disappear like that. And storms don't hang backpacks 50 feet up in trees. The Norway incident took place during a cold weather training rotation, the kind meant to remind you how small mistakes turn serious much faster once water and cold are involved. We were operating offshore at night, far enough out that there were no lights on the horizon, no shipping lanes nearby, no land visible. The sea was calm in a way that only happens occasionally in that part of the world, flat enough that the water reflected the sky instead of breaking it up. Cold air, steady breathing. Everything slowed down by temperature. We were moving at low speed, maintaining spacing and running passive systems. No reason to make noise or rush. Just steady movement through open water while everyone stayed alert for anything that didn't belong. At first, nothing did. The water rolled beneath us in slow, heavy swells that barely registered against the hull. You could hear it more than feel it. A low, constant sound that blended into the background until you stopped paying attention to it consciously. That changed when the water beneath us darkened. It was a gradual shift in tone, like a shadow passing under glass. At first, I assumed it was a whale. That made sense. The region supports large marine life, and whales surface and dive without warning. Their mass can distort water patterns in ways that look unnatural if you're not expecting it. I adjusted my stance and leaned slightly, trying to get a better angle. The shape beneath us was enormous. It wasn't long and narrow like most whales. It was broad and smooth. The surface didn't break the water. It just stayed below it, moving slowly enough that the displacement was almost gentle. The shape slowed. Then it stopped. The water above it stilled in a way that caught my attention immediately. The natural movement of the sea didn't resume. It was as if something solid had pressed upward and held there. I was still thinking whale when the eye opened. There was no build-up, no ripple, just a slow separation in the darkness beneath the surface, revealing a single massive eye opening directly upward. It was positioned at the top and center of the body, oriented straight toward us. And the color registered first. Red. Bright, deep, and saturated red, like something lit from within rather than reflecting light from outside. The surface of it was smooth and wet, catching what little ambient light there was and bending it in a way that made depth hard to judge. But the scale hit. The eye alone was enormous. Later, when I tried to put numbers to it, 50 feet across was the closest estimate that didn't feel exaggerated. It filled most of the visible space beneath us, stretching wider than the boat itself. No people detail stood out, no blinking. It simply opened and remained open. Nobody moved. I felt the instinct to step back, even though there was nowhere to go. The cold air felt sharper all of a sudden, like my lungs had decided to remind me where I was. The water around the eye remained unnaturally still. No bubbles or surface break, just that massive shape holding position directly beneath us. Close enough that if it had surfaced, it would have displaced the boat easily. Someone behind me breathed out slowly. For a few seconds, I waited for it to react, for the eye to track movement, for the body to shift, for anything that suggested it was aware of us in a way that would require action. Nothing happened. The eye stayed open, fixed and unblinking. If it was looking at us, there was no way to tell. And then the eye began to close. As it did, the water above it darkened again, returning to its earlier tone. The stillness broke, small ripples spread outward, then larger ones, as if the sea had remembered how it was supposed to act. The shape beneath us began to sink. The shadow grew deeper, broader, then stretched downward until it faded into total darkness. There was no wake or turbulence, no sign of disturbance beyond what we'd already seen. Eventually, the senior officer gave the order to continue, and we did. The rest of the night passed without incident. No additional movement, no return of the shape. The sea remained calm all the way back. I replayed it in my head afterward many times. We never encountered it again, not in that area or anywhere else. And I never saw another eye like it. But I think about that moment sometimes when I'm near open water, especially at night. Because whatever that thing was, it existed there long before we passed over it. And I have a feeling it's still there today. Well, I left active duty years ago. Not because of anything in this story. My time ended the same way it does for most people in that line of work. Rotations end, bodies wear down, life moves forward. You pack up what you can carry and you leave the rest behind. Most of what I remember from those years blends together now. The days, the briefings, the places. A lot of it fades the way it should. That's normal. You don't need to hold on to every detail to know who you were or what you did. I don't think about the moments I talked about every day. I don't connect them to each other. I don't look for patterns. That kind of thinking doesn't really help. What I do think about, occasionally, is how easy it is to assume that unfamiliar things behave the same way familiar ones do. Most of the time, that assumption works. Animals act like animals. Terrain acts like terrain. Water behaves like water. Sometimes, though, you run into something that doesn't react at all, doesn't escalate, doesn't retreat, doesn't acknowledge you in any way that fits your expectations. It simply exists alongside what you're doing, briefly, and then it's gone. I never felt chased in any of those moments. Never felt hunted, really. Even in Somalia, when one of our own disappeared, there was no sense of pursuit afterward. no lingering presence. Things happened, and then they didn't. I've had people ask me in different ways whether I think those things are still out there, whether I think they're connected, whether I think they were meant to be seen. I don't know. I don't think that question matters as much as people want it to. I don't tell these stories as a warning, and I don't tell them as proof of anything. I'm not asking anyone to believe anything. I'm just describing what I saw and what happened afterward. That's it. I don't avoid jungles, deserts, mountains, or open water because of this. I still go outside. I still travel. I still pay attention to my surroundings the same way I always did. But I'm more comfortable now with the idea that the world isn't obligated to make sense just because we think it is. Some places have rules that don't include us. Some things don't care whether we understand them. And sometimes, the only reason you're allowed to leave a place is because you got lucky.